Greetings, programs, and welcome back to the TV thing. This has been a slightly delayed episode because if you follow my main channel, you'll know I've been a bit sick recently, but I'm starting to feel a little bit on the mend at this point. Hopefully enough on the mend to get through a whole video without trying to cough up a lung. Anyway, so this time around I'm going to be talking about Ajin, Demi-Human, which is an anime series that popped up on Netflix recently, and, well, I say recently, it was earlier in the year, and I finally got around to watching it after having it on my favorited list for a while. So before I start talking about the show itself, this is one of these ones where there's various adaptations. It's all based on a manga. There have been a trio of films that are based on the manga, and then there's this anime adaptation, this TV series adaptation. And I don't quite know how this fits in with the films, if it's a continuation from the films, or if it's just telling the same story but in a slightly different way than the films. Wikipedia doesn't help me much in that regard. It just tells me that it's the same studio and the same production team. So that alone makes me think maybe it is picking up from where the films left off, but I don't know that for sure. It might not be the case at all. It might just be it's the same people making it, but it's a different take on the same story, as it were. Now, talking of the people that made it, in this case, it is a studio called Polygon, and Polygon, is it Polygon Pictures, or is it? Yeah, it is Polygon Pictures. Polygon Pictures actually have made a number of notable anime, and from what I understand, they're a reasonably small studio, so they only really work on one project at a time. And one of the previous projects they've worked on, which is a show I'm quite a fan of, is Knights of Sidonia. Now, I know I've mentioned this in videos and streams in the past, but I don't think I've mentioned it at any point so far on this channel in the videos that I've done. I might go back and rewatch that again at some point to do a video on it, but suffice it to say, I think it's a rather good show. But with it being Polygon, well, they have a somewhat distinctive animation style. Now, they work in 3D, and that alone might be enough to put people off. I mean, in Knights of Sidonia, for instance, it wasn't particularly, that they weren't going for particular realism with the faces, and everything was basically fully 3D because it's set in space and there's not really anything that they could have to work with. Whereas with Ajin, sometimes the background elements are 3D. The characters are all fully 3D, and I have to say that the character models, the people you see on screen, that they've gone for a more naturalistic look than they did with Knights of Sidonia. But a lot of the background elements they look like either still photographs that have been manipulated to have a certain look, or they are digitally painted elements, or in some cases they are 3D rendered, whatever. So that is it's not quite as like the backgrounds aren't as clear and detailed as in other anime that I've seen. And the character models, there's something quite particular about them as well. Now, it's not just the fact that they are rendered in 3D, which gives them quite a distinctive look. And as I said, they're a bit more naturalistic. The faces, they've done quite a good job, I think, of making the faces quite distinct, and they look like they could be actual people. But the thing that might be off-putting for some people watching this show, and it was the same with Knights of Sidonia, is that there's a kind of curious, almost stop-motion feel about the character motion in particular. Now, other elements of motion on the screen appear to be running at whatever the frame rate of the show is, which is, I don't know what it is for Japanese television, but it'll be like either 25 or 30 frames a second or something like that. But the characters seem to be it's really, I don't know how to describe it without making it sound bad, but they seem kind of jerky. This is where the whole idea of stop motion comes in. I think it's maybe a deliberate kind of, like, I think stop motion is the right way to be thinking about it. I think that's why they do it that way. But for some people, it almost seems like the characters are running at a lower frame rate than the background, if that makes any sense. And every time I've gone back to watch Knights of Sidonia, and I've watched it through, I say every time, I think I've only watched it through twice. But it's I spend like the first 2 or 3 episodes just getting used to that character animation. And it is, I think for some people it would be distracting enough that they possibly wouldn't be able to concentrate on what's happening in the show. And that would be a pity, because Knights of Sidonia is good, and this is pretty good as well. I don't think it's quite as entertaining to me, but it's a different story. And I don't even know quite where it's going yet, because this is only the first season of this anime adaptation. There is definitely another one, because we've had, I think I've mentioned the three films. There is definitely going to be a second season of the anime, and because there has been a second season of the anime, it has, as of earlier this month, been airing in Japan. And if it follows the pattern of the release for the first series, it probably means it'll pop up on Netflix either late this year or very early next year. So I won't have that long to wait until getting to see what I hope will be a concluding part. Because what happened with the Knights of Sidonia is, again, manga adaptation, and they adapted the first 2 seasons out of something like the first 3 or 4 volumes or books or whatever of the manga. And it kind of leaves off at a point where clearly there could be more, and it's not really, it doesn't conclude. It just kind of, they tie things up sufficiently for the end of a season, but it doesn't conclude the story. But it's unlikely at this point that they will go back and adapt more and make a third series of Knights of Sidonia, which I would really enjoy, but sadly I don't think it's going to happen. So I hope that with the second series of Ajin that we do actually get more of a conclusion, because it's kind of irksome when you get a show that just kind of hangs off in the air, and it's like, well, I would like either there to have been more, or else for them to have tied it up properly. But no, sadly, that doesn't always happen. So as to the plot, well, in this world, which is much like our own, there is basically one important difference, and that is, it's basically set in the present day. What has happened is that in the time frame of this world, about a decade and a half before the events of what happens on screen, it is discovered that there are an immortal strain of humans, basically, the so-called Ajin, and a lot of it is to do with the politics and the reactions of society to this somewhat startling fact. And this is one of the hitting my headphones there. This is one of the reasons I like this show, is because it takes this premise and it doesn't go. It's not cartoony. It doesn't go off on a tangent where it doesn't do the kind of comic book Superman thing. It very much concentrates on, well, what would be the real world consequences? What would be the international relations consequences? What would this mean for the politics of the various countries where these people pop up? And in stark contrast to any other kind of thing that I've read, well, barring one thing, but it's a thing that's not been published anywhere, so it's hard to really make a comparison because there's no one else will know what I'm talking about. But it's like, well, this actually, even if you discovered you were one of these Ajin, it wouldn't really necessarily be a good thing for you, because these people are rare. They are a commodity, because the governments of the world want to understand what the Ajin are, and they want to see if they can exploit the Ajin. And so discovering that you're an Ajin isn't necessarily a good thing. And that's basically what happens to the protagonist, who is a young lad called Kei Nagai. And as with a lot of Ajin, and it starts off, I mean, we learn that there's only about 14 known Ajin in the entire world. So, these are they're incredibly rare. But as you go over the course of the series, you discover that there are more than that. The 14 that they mention are just the ones that are known about. But basically, the main way that people discover they are Ajin are they have horrific accidents that should have killed them, and then they don't die. Well, technically they do die. The way it works for the Ajin is it's kind of like Captain Jack Harkness. I don't know if you ever watched Torchwood, but the whole shtick with Captain Jack and his immortality was that he could die, but he would revive. And so if you consider what the implications of that are, you could have all kinds of horrific accidents, and it would, they feel every single bit of, what happens to them. If you fall out of, a 10-story building, you're going to splat painfully onto the ground, and then you will revive, you will come back to life, but it won't have been a pleasant experience. So this is, it's the reality of being an Ajin, and that's what happens to Kei. He gets mangled by a truck in front of a whole crowd of people. So there's absolutely no doubt about, who or what he is. And so he has to go on the run because he does not want to get captured by the government. He doesn't want to end up as being a test subject. Because one of the things they do in the opening episode is they do it in quite a neat way. I think they introduce this world in quite an efficient manner. They kind of have these like leaked bits of video online on the equivalent of live leaks or whatever, and it shows a known Ajin test subject just being repeatedly like killed and tortured, and they're just doing all these utterly inhumane experiments on him secretly. And there's all these kind of rumors about what happens to the Ajin, and officially they're just kept under protective custody, but unofficially, there's all these kind of rumors which it turns out are largely true, that all these horrible things are done to them in the name of science that isn't really science. And it does go to some rather dark places. You get shades of the human experimentation that was done in Nazi Germany and on Chinese prisoners of war by the Japanese in World War II. So it being a Japanese show, that's probably not a particularly comfortable place to go for a lot of Japanese viewers. So yeah, it really does, it doesn't pull any punches in that regard. It kind of tries to posit what would this be like in the real world, given that humans can sometimes be absolutely horrible to each other, and I think it absolutely does a really good job of that. Now, over the course of the series, and as ever, I'm not really going to give away much in the way of plot because I want people to go and watch these things for themselves. You kind of learn more about Kai specifically, and you also learn more about the other Ajin, and you learn that he's not the only one out there. And there's another character that gets introduced, and it comes to a point where things really start to come to a head. And there's another character in particular who is just so utterly dissatisfied with having to live in the shadows, with having to live in secret, to hide who he is. And you can kind of sympathise with his position, but he's not a very nice character indeed. And it actually reminded me a little bit of the fifth season of Babylon 5, which was trying for so much and achieved so little. But the fifth season of Babylon 5 was a heavy plot arc in that was to do with telepaths and the rights of telepaths, and how people, non-telepaths were scared of them. And there was this was all following after a whole bunch of other stuff, because there's a whole bunch of stuff in the Babylon 5 universe to do with how telepaths were regulated and how society kept them under control. And that it doesn't really apply, like that stuff doesn't really apply that much to Ajin, because it wasn't even, like, governments are scared of the Ajin, they're scared of what they represent. They want the status quo. And so they're quite happy to lock away the Ajin in secret and do all these inhumane things to them, and to the point of declaring them to not be human. And that's how they justify it. Oh, they aren't human, we can do whatever we want. So it's kind of like, well, Kai tumbling into this world and getting tied up with this other character, Mr. Sato, who you can kind of understand where he's coming from, but at the same time, he's not a nice guy. And it's kind of like Kai trying to find his own way. And along the way, you also discover that Kai himself, he's an interesting protagonist because he is cold. I mean, he is super cold. And there's also other things that like, by the end of the revelation at the end of the first series is that he is something, like, he's all along, it's kind of made clear that he's not just a regular kid. And then you discover that, yeah, he's not just a regular Ajin either. I don't think it's really a spoiler to say that, because I felt like it was leading up to that, and it kind of, like, the series itself makes clear that there are like, one of the things I've not even covered yet is that the Ajin have this some Ajin, in fact, it's not entirely clear if it's all, but all Ajin aren't the same, that some of them have things they can do that are different. And the kind of main manifestation of this are the so-called black ghosts, or IBMs as they get termed by, I think there's one particular character who's like a US researcher who was originally Japanese, but he basically gets poached by the US. Because the US, and this is another bit of the whole international politics thing, the US heavily leans on Japan, and in theory they've got like a bilateral research agreement, but basically the US is just completely bullying Japan to give them all the information they can get on Ajins. So they can, certain Ajins can manifest these black ghosts, and it's kind of almost, and again, jumping back to some completely different sci-fi, there's this whole bit in Stanislav Lem's Solaris where people are trying to classify the unclassifiable, and there's an element of that in this show as well, that the human researchers from, I didn't say human, I don't know why I said human there, but the researchers from Japan are trying to understand and classify and label and pin down and do all those kind of things that people do. So they're trying to understand what the Ajins are and what they can do, and it turns out that Kai is something a bit different than they'd discovered before, but I won't say how exactly. But he's just different as a person anyway, and it kind of becomes quite readily apparent that he's got some kind of personality disorder, basically, and you maybe see what seems to be the glimmerings of some kind of growth of empathy, and then it just turns that on its head. So I really liked that. Like, he's not a likable character, but I like the way they developed his character, and I'm really interested to see where it goes in the second season, because he's not a typical hero at all. And despite that, he still somehow has one or two people that end up liking him, but I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I really want to see the second series of this. I definitely recommend the first series. Like I said, the animation is probably going to be off-putting to some people, and I would say stick with it at least a couple of episodes, and after a certain point you hopefully just won't notice it anymore. You'll just be able to watch it and enjoy the story, which is really quite good, but for some people it might be enough to off-put them. So yeah, if you're one of those, all I can say is, oh well, you missed a nice thing, you missed a good thing. So that's it for now. I am watching other various things on Netflix and other places at the moment. I don't know what my next thing is going to be about, but we'll see. I'm also nearing the end of a book at the moment, so there's every chance that my next video will in fact be a books one. And also, hooray, I've made it through an entire recording without coughing, which is something I've not been able to do for the last week and a bit, so this is a bit of a first. So hopefully you've enjoyed this, and if you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave any thoughts and comments below, you can sub to my channel or my main gaming channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.